Given we are lucky to have GTN HQ in Bath, which, for those of you who are unaware, is bang smack in the centre of some rather hilly terrain, I thought it made sense to pedal out here into the local surroundings to talk about how best to tackle a hilly bike leg during a race. So, to keep things nice and simple, here are my 5 go-to tips for making you more efficient during a hilly ride. So, tip number 1, and that's our bike choice. Whether to opt for our time trial bike or perhaps select our traditional and trusty road bike. Now, I'll not beat around the bush here because we at GTN are always going to advise that you use a time trial bike where possible, regardless of the course, because it is just always going to be faster. However, I do appreciate that when you see a hilly course profile, it's all too easy to think, surely that road bike is going to be the better machine to choose. But we do know from research that actually if you can keep your speeds above something around about 15 kilometers an hour, there is an awful lot of gains to be had from using a time trial bike, and staying in the aero bars are certainly a good option. In fact, we actually did a whole video about whether or not to stay in the time trial bars or not, and if they're faster, and I'll throw to that at the end of this video. So as long as you can ensure that you can keep pedaling faster than that rough minimum of 15 kilometers an hour or so, you can rest assured that all the associated aerodynamic benefits such as aero bars that come with riding on your time trial bike will add up to be faster in the long run than perhaps opting for your road bike. Now that moves us along to tip number 2, which is our gearing choice. Now it doesn't seem so long ago that a time trial bike, it seemed, came equipped as a rite of passage, it seemed, with a particular type of gears, and those were always big gears. Now what do I mean by that? Well, generally it was a 53 tooth and a 42 tooth inner chainring combo on the front, and moving over to the cassette there at the rear, you usually only had about a 10 gear ratio if you're lucky, and that was usually something like 11-21 or maybe a 12-23. And at the cassette on the rear, you would usually have something that was a 10 gear ratio of 11-21 or maybe perhaps 12-23 as your easiest option. Now, thankfully technology does move along and things have changed somewhat. Now indeed, on the front of this bike here, which is a bang up to date model, I still only have a 53 tooth chainring, but I've got a 39 tooth chainring on the inside of that combo. It's also quite common for time trial bikes, and lots of bikes in fact, to now come equipped with compact combinations, which might be something like a 50 or a 52 perhaps outer chainring, and then a 34 or even perhaps slightly smaller inner chainring. And this gives us a much easier gear to turn and can really promote higher cadences, which helps a lot when we're in the hills. Now moving back to the cassette, well, things have changed there too, thankfully, and nowadays 11 gears are fairly commonplace. You can even have 12 speed gear ratio options there too. That opens up all sorts of different spreads of gears like 11-28, which is something that I used an awful lot when I was racing, but you can even get 12-28 and up to 12-30, which gives you the options for any type of hilly racing situations. And these gears are almost always coming fitted with the bikes as they are new, or you can add them as aftermarket additions. Right, so that takes us on to our third tip, and that is momentum. And what I mean here is that when we're trying to ride well, we should always be looking up the road ahead of us, because the object is always to keep riding as fast as we can. So if we're riding along, battling along even, on our TT bars, and a hill takes us unaware, the last thing you want to do is suddenly find yourself in the wrong gear as you hit that approach to the hill. Now this is where things can get tricky, because you don't want to lose all that hard-earned momentum and speed that you've gained, but you do need to make sure that you're in the right gear to make sure you keep that momentum into the base of the hill for as long as you can. Now granted, this is a little bit tricky, so I've got a few key tips to take into consideration for making the most of keeping that momentum. Firstly, you need to be able to gauge your speed relative to the gear you're in and how steep that hill appears to be. Now, if it doesn't look like it rises too steeply, then an initial option would be to move down a few gears easier in your cassette first, just to get you into the base of the climb and keep that momentum going that you've built and you don't want to lose. Then you can think about dropping down into your small chainring as you go up the hill and it gets a bit steeper. And this means that you're not going to get into too much of a muddle trying to change too many gears simultaneously, because this can be a recipe for disaster with things like a drop chain a real possibility. So secondly, if that hill does seem to rise rise up in front of you fairly quickly and steeply, then you are going to have to anticipate changing gear to save grinding to a halt by hitting that hill in far too big a gear. So you're going to have to drop down into that small chainring. Now you're going to have to anticipate your cadence shooting up, because that's what happens when you go into an easier gear. But if you choose the right point to do this, then it should be a nice smooth transition into the hill, and again you're going to keep most of that momentum that you've carried into it. Now lastly, at the other end of the hill, you need to really focus and be able to pushing over the top of the hill, because it's all too easy to see the crest and go, yes, I've made it, and then stop pushing hard. In fact, that's just human nature. But rest assured, you can definitely make up tons of time in all your other competitors if you're in a race, because if you add up all the hills that you're going to go through over the course of the bike leg, that really does add up. So that brings me on to next tip, which is number 4, and that is keeping your weight down. Now, for a moment, let's go back to my previous tip talking about momentum, because if we're talking about a flat or even a rolling course, the weight of our bike actually doesn't really matter much once we're up to speed, because you keep that momentum going. However, once you start going uphill, things drastically change altogether, and that's just simply because physics kicks in. Now, I'm not suggesting that you rush off to your local bike shop and try and grab the lightest frame that you can get your hands on. Nothing quite as over the top as that, but there are a couple key things that I think you can pay attention to when you're setting your bike up for a hilly bike race. Don't overload with water bottles. Now, as tempting as it can be to approach a race with complete self-sufficiency, having everything you need to get through that race with your own hydration and nutrition, before you know it, you've got traditional bottles in the frame, you've got extra bottles behind the saddle, and let's not forget, a lot of bikes these days, if you're lucky, actually have an integrated front water bottle in the frame set too. And if we start doing the maths on this and you start adding up these traditional bottles, extra bottles doubling up here, any extra liquid that might be in the frame set, all of that can add up to maybe even 2 kilos of liquid, and that is heavy. And another thing is our wheel sets, and many of us, me included, are very fortunate to have some nice deep rim carbon wheels that we just love to put on, especially for race day, but regardless of what that terrain might be. And rolling weight makes even more of a difference at times than any other type of weight on our bike, so you really have to pay attention to having lighter and potentially shallower wheels on your bike. In fact, if you have a look at a lot of the pros, you will notice their wheel sets being particularly shallow for hilly races, and it would almost appear that they might even have a training set of wheels on. Right, that brings me on to my 5th and final point, which is pedaling action. Now, admittedly, this isn't necessarily specific just to riding in the hills, but I do think that having an ability to pedal nice and smoothly all the way up a hill definitely makes it easier to make progress. What we want to try and avoid is a real push and pull action to our pedaling, rather trying to think about pedaling through the full circle of the stroke. I always think it's quite good to think about a clock face and trying to apply even pressure all the way around as you're pedaling. Now, this will just make things a lot more efficient, especially when you're on a climb and you're under even more pressure to try and get towards that top. So that wraps up my 5 simple tips for trying to help you tackle a bike ride the next time it goes uphill. Try to adopt some of these the next time you are in a race perhaps, and don't forget to let me know how that went and if it helped in the comments section below. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, so please hit that thumb up like button, and don't forget to find the globe on screen to get all the other videos on the channel. If you want to see a video we did that's got 3 weekly workouts that you might like to do, well, you can find that down here. And not forgetting that video I talked about earlier about is it faster to stay in the aero bars, well, it's down here.